The last lecture for this unit is about African Americans and women and how their roles changed during this era. And I'm going to start with African Americans. After they gained the right to vote, guaranteed rights to equal protection under the law and citizenship, in the South and in lots of places in the North, societies and communities went about stopping them from voting. And they did that in a variety of ways. One of the ways is they would tell people they can only vote if they own property. Another popular way was to take a literacy test. And of course, the famous one is the poll tax, where you had to pay a special tax or price in order to vote. White people could get around all of these voting suppression tactics by using a grandfather clause. The grandfather clause simply stated that if your grandfather voted in an election, then you were exempt from owning property, having to take a literacy test, or a poll tax. There were no African Americans who could prove that their grandparents voted. This led to segregation. Segregation is really, simple definition, is separating people by race, as exemplified by the picture here. This happened all over the South, but it also happened in the North. It happened all over Indiana. The Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow was an old spiritual character in songs, and the laws that stopped people from being together, that separated them, were known as Jim Crow laws. These were simply laws that made segregation legal, legalized the separation of people by race. The picture down here is of a dining room for colored people. Plessy versus Ferguson is the most important Supreme Court case of this era because it is the Supreme Court case that made segregation legal. It said that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution gave everybody equal access to voting and equal access under the law, but that does not translate, according to the courts at this time, as equality in society. There was a big push during this era to create a nationwide anti-lynching law. It is, of course, illegal to murder somebody, but the problem was in these racist communities, and especially in the South, if someone was murdered or lynched or hung as a hate crime or a crime against somebody's race, then that court case would happen in the community in which the crime took place. And almost every time, no, not almost, every single time those courts brought the cases up, the people who did the murder were found innocent because they were going into a jury of their peers, a jury of other racists. So the anti-lynching law was supposed to get enacted so that you would move lynching or those murder trials out of those local courts and into national courts where the judges were appointed by the president, but it didn't quite happen during this time period. There were no anti-lynching laws, and people got away with murder in these racist communities. Because discrimination was often violent, but also it was prevalent everywhere, there were organizations that popped up to fight discrimination, the most famous of which is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And it was really created by African Americans to fight discrimination, fight segregation, to work towards individual civil rights for all minorities. Was founded by this guy, Booker T. Washington. No, not Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois. And I forget her name, but she's the one the white lady here who gave them money to start the organization. There he is. There's W.E.B. Du Bois. The National Urban League was just still around today. They're the ones, they still sponsor the job fair at the Black Expo every year. The National Urban League is a nationwide organization that was created just to give African Americans more opportunities to get jobs. It was started by George Washington Carver, who became he's the guy who was messed around with a peanut and became super famous as a scientist during this era. Booker T. Washington, another famous African American leader of this era, founded the Negro Business League. Not around anymore.